it helps you sort of to have an identity outside of academia, to have sort of self-worth in yourself, right? To understand that you are a person that isn't just bound up with your academic identity. Because if, again, the academic job market doesn't work out, the crisis that one has about their sense of self-worth is like maybe a little bit less knowing that you have value in some other capacity.
Welcome to the Personal Finance for PhDs podcast, a higher education in personal finance. This podcast is for PhDs and PhDs-to-be who want to explore the hidden curriculum of finances to learn the best practices for money management, career advancement, and advocacy for yourself and others. I'm your host, Dr. Emily Roberts, a financial educator specializing in early career PhDs and founder of Personal Finance for PhDs. This is Season 20, Episode 5, and today my guest is Dr. Ilana Horwitz, a professor at Tulane University and the author of the newly released book, The Entrepreneurial Scholar, A New Mindset for Success in Academia and Beyond. Ilana explains how a grad student or academic can be an entrepreneurial scholar and why it is so beneficial in an environment of uncertainty and limited resources. Ilana and I discuss the necessity for grad students to become the CEOs of their own education and careers. Finally, we explore in more detail ideas from the chapter on how to leverage resources, both human and monetary. The tax year 2024 version of my tax return preparation workshop, How to Complete Your PhD Trainee Tax Return and Understand It Too, is now available. This pre-recorded educational workshop explains how to identify, calculate, and report your higher education-related income and expenses on your federal tax return. Whether you are a graduate student, postdoc, or postbac, domestic or international, there is a version of this workshop designed just for you. I do license these workshops to universities, but in the case that yours declines your request for sponsorship, you can purchase the appropriate version as an individual. Go to pfforphds.com/tax return workshop to read more details and purchase the workshop. You can find the show notes for this episode at pfforphds.com/s20e5. Without further ado, here's my interview with Dr. Ilana Horwitz. I am delighted to have a return guest on the podcast today, Dr. Ilana Horwitz, who's a professor at Tulane University and the author of the newly released book titled The Entrepreneurial Scholar. And Ilana's previous episode on the podcast was Season 16, Episode 4, and we get a lot more of like her personal story about being a parent in graduate school and like all the resources she marshaled to, financially get through that period. But it's interesting, she and I were just looking back at our email exchanges. We first got connected back, over a year, about 2 years ago, because she was starting to write this book and wanted to, wanted me to give a short interview for it. And I ended up interviewing her, and that came out quite a while ago. But now the book that she's been working on for so long is finally out. And so that's our subject for today, the Entrepreneurial Scholar. So Ilana, thank you so much for coming back on the podcast. Will you please give a brief introduction for the audience?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Emily. It's great to be back. As you mentioned, yes, I am trained as a sociologist of religion and education. I am in the Jewish Studies and Sociology department at Tulane University. I've been here for 4 years. And before that, I spent a decade at Stanford as a grad student and as a postdoc.
Excellent. I want to jump right in to what is this book about? Because it's not about, as I, maybe thought just by reading the title, it's not about academics or PhDs who want to become entrepreneurs. We have a slightly different spin on that. So can you tell us the working definitions you have for like an entrepreneur and also an entrepreneurial scholar from the book?
Absolutely. Yes. So this is a little bit of a different definition of what entrepreneurship means. When I say entrepreneurship and when I talk about entrepreneurial scholarship, I'm specifically talking about the ability to generate ideas with very limited resources while navigating an environment of high uncertainty. What I don't mean by entrepreneurship is I'm not talking about trying to take a neoliberal approach to academia that advocates for the corporatization of the academy. I am not talking about applying market models to universities. And I'm also not talking about the kinds of sort of business-oriented research firms. And as you mentioned, I'm also not talking about necessarily starting some sort of venture on the side, which is like what most people think of when I say entrepreneurial thinking. And so again, being an entrepreneurial scholar means being able to generate ideas, right? That is the product. That is like the currency with which we work, being able to generate ideas with very limited resources while navigating an environment of high uncertainty. That is what entrepreneurs do. And it's actually also what scholars do when we are sort of working within the constraints of what academia is.
One of the things that I found really interesting about your book is that, and this is actually how you ended up quoting me, like within this subject matter, is that we're not just talking about like academics like you, like who have, career professors and that kind of thing. We're going all the way back to basically the grad student stage and how this mindset can be helpful, in fact, is necessary even from that point of making that transition from undergrad to graduate student. And you just mentioned, ideas are the product that we work with within academia. And so I just wanted you to expound on this a little bit more, like what is this transition that a person has to go through from being an excellent undergraduate to being a successful graduate student, and why do so many people kind of get stuck or mired along the way and don't make that transition successfully?
Yeah, absolutely. The main mindset shift that I think people need to make is being able to shift from being a consumer of information to a producer of knowledge. And I really didn't understand this, I think, when I started my PhD program. And it was at my orientation that a professor said, right, to all the incoming students, like, your job is no longer to consume information, it is to produce knowledge. And what that meant for me is this like realization that my entire life I have been evaluated on the basis of like my ability to consume information and regurgitate it back to the teacher, right? That's what we generally do in K-12. That's mostly what we do in college, right? And I was actually never very good at this, which is ultimately I think what helped me love graduate school. But when I realized that graduate school is about being able to is really about this production of knowledge, meaning that you are now like playing detective, and it is up to you what is the problem in the world that you want to pursue, and it is up to you how you want to pursue it and when you want to pursue it and what resources you want to pursue it. Like, you have so much agency in the process, and your grades no longer matter. And for me, that was really liberating. But for a lot of people, that's really debilitating. And the reason it is debilitating is because people who often end up in PhD programs are people who were so good at school, and meaning that they were so good at navigating what I call or sociologists of education call the hidden curriculum of school, like the rules and the routines and regulations, right? They're like pros at this, and they're like, oh, I'm so good at school that I should go pro. And going pro means going to a PhD program, right? You are a career sort of student. Career students aren't necessarily great at having the mindset to sort of think outside the confines of what is expected of you. And so when grad school starts and you have a bunch of, requirements, it's okay, but then the script falls away. And then that is when I think panic sets in for a lot of people, because it's like, wait, now there are no rules and there are no routines and there are no regulations. Like, what am I supposed to do? And then there's this resentment of like, why isn't my advisor telling me what to do? And like, why isn't it super clear? And so the ability to like, instead of feeling that moment as debilitating, but instead of embracing it and embracing that autonomy, I think is like the big mindset shift that needs to happen.
I totally agree. And I see, in retrospect, how I kind of faltered in that myself during graduate school. And it was difficult. And you just used the term like script. I think that's a really, really good way of putting this. Like, as you said, you can master how it is to be good at school, all the way up through the end of undergrad and be successful in that. And then once you reach graduate school, you have to really forge your own path. And it's not it's not just, XYZ and then you get a degree. It's a completely like unique experience. And the term that you use in the book, which I really loved, is becoming the CEO of your own education. And one of the reasons why I liked this is because it made me think about your education is not just what you do in graduate school. It's a holistic picture of everything that goes into who you are professionally. And that could be experiences that you have through your classes and through your research and with your advisor and with your colleagues, but it could include a whole lot more than that. And you had a lot of examples in the book of people seeking out experiences that, using this mindset of being an entrepreneurial scholar that ultimately led them to the creation that they, were in graduate school or in their careers and to do. So I just really like that like framing of it. Did you want to say anything more about that phrasing or how you view it?
Yeah, that's such a great question because, right, my PhD is from a school of education. So I also think of education as a much more holistic endeavor. And when I think about one's PhD journey, and if I reflect on my own, right, it's so much more than what I learned in my classes. And so, for example, in the book, I talk about this experience that I created for myself where I realized at one moment, maybe around my fourth year, that I really needed teaching experience. As a Stanford PhD student in my program, like I didn't have to teach. I only had to be a research assistant. And I was like, how do I create an opportunity for myself to go teach? I ended up going to teach at a community college. And so when I think about my own education, I learned so much from that experience of being a community college professor, both from the students in the class who were very different than most of the people I spent time with. They were like working adults, mostly first gen low income students of color. And so not only did I learn from them, but I also learned what it means to sort of educate a different population and what it means to sort of talk about sociological concepts to people who generally don't come from elite backgrounds. And so all of that, right, was part of my education. And my education also, when I think about my PhD, was about navigating things like gender expectations in the academy and like being a sort of in a household where I had to navigate gender dynamics as everyone mostly has to. And it was about doing a bunch of side hustles so that I could learn like what does it mean to do statistics like for an actual client as opposed to doing it for a class. So yes, education is this like much more holistic experience, as you mentioned.
And now this is a little bit of a sidebar, but it's kind of a soapbox that I get onto from time to time on the podcast, which is I really think it's short-sighted of graduate programs to disallow their students, and maybe this was not your experience, but it is in some places, to disallow their students from taking outside work opportunities, very much like the ones you just mentioned, adjuncting, side hustling, using their skills that they've learned in graduate school. I get it that they want them to stay focused on finishing their dissertations. But it's, as I just said, it's very short-sighted because many of these kinds of side hustles can be augmenting, as we were just talking about, being the CEO of your own education and making you a better prepared professional once you get to the end of graduate school. So yeah, just a little sidebar there, but I don't know if you have any comments about that and how faculty might in some places view these kind of side endeavors.
Yeah, I think it's tricky, right? Because as you said, like I understand from the faculty's perspective that they want students to be really focused because once you have some sort of job, especially if it's like a full-time job, it's really hard to stay focused on your research. But I also feel very strongly, and I did this myself, that when you take those outside opportunities, you are both building your skill set, developing a network that's really important, and also like just being really realistic about the fact that most people who start a PhD program are not going to end up in a professor position, right? A very, very tiny percentage of people will end up in the being able to get a tenure track position or even a non-tenure track position. So it's just like to navigate the uncertainty of academia means being really realistic with what the prospects are and to buffer yourself against that sort of crisis that is going to come when you realize you can't get a job. It's really helpful to know that you have other options. In my case, the School of Education, look, it didn't have, I think there was a policy and some professors sort of instituted the policy more than others. I will say that there was certainly not enthusiasm for me pursuing this teaching position at a community college, but I made the case of why it was beneficial, and so it was allowed. And then there was a bunch of stuff that I did without telling anybody, and it was totally fine because I'm very good at being the CEO of my own education, and I sort of knew what I could manage and what was valuable, like what when I thought about it from a cost benefit ratio, like how much time am I spending on something versus the value I get out of it. And I have no regrets about pursuing anything outside of academia. And in the book, there are several examples of people who I interviewed of how transformative those opportunities were. Because one is it helps you sort of to have an identity outside of academia, to have sort of self-worth in yourself, right? To understand that you are a person that isn't just bound up with your academic identity. Because if, again, the academic job market doesn't work out, the crisis that one has about their sense of self-worth is like maybe a little bit less knowing that you have value in some other sort of capacity. And there have been some like amazing opportunities that people got because, one person who I interviewed, Tamara, worked for Kamala Harris on Fridays, and that led to a bunch of other opportunities. And particularly, like if you've never worked outside of an academic setting, like if you are a person who's pretty much going straight through from undergrad to your PhD, it's really important to work in the outside world to understand sort of like how the real world functions and not just be in like the academic bubble.
Absolutely. I totally agree everything you just said. And I guess maybe a corollary or like another interpretation of CEO of your own education is CEO of your own career, because you don't know for sure that you are going to end up in academia. And it makes sense, as you were just saying, to have built an image of yourself that's bigger than just an academic in case that career path, if it's one you're even going for, doesn't work out. And you can still be an entrepreneurial scholar in graduate school and pivot to something else outside of it. But the point that I wanted to make is that being the CEO of your own career maybe includes some career development experiences that you aren't automatically being pushed into as a graduate student, but that are available to you probably from the graduate school and the career center and so forth. And just being able to like spend some time exploring those professional development resources and career ideas can really help you whenever are making that next transition point.
Right. And I talk in the book about like you cannot predict the future, but you can help create it. And that's, I think, an important lesson because all these things that you're doing can help create your future. And it helps sort of offset that uncertainty that we as grad students sort of have to live with on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, and I really love that you talked in the book about uncertainty and about limited resources. And oh my gosh, how timely is this? We're recording this in February 2025. And as of now, there's been these executive orders. We don't know in academia how this is all going to shake out, whether there's going to be a massive funding decrease, layoffs. We don't know. We're in a period of uncertainty. And so it's horrible timing in a sense, but it's good timing for your book to like sort of land in this moment where in academia, there's probably a lot of questions going around about what resources do I have? What's the value that I can bring here? What is my career path going to look like? And so, well, for that reason, if not any other, maybe it's time to, pick up this book.
Hmm.
Emily here for a brief interlude. Tax season is in full swing, and the best place to go for information tailored to you as a graduate student, postdoc, or postbac is pfforphds.com/tax. From that page, I have linked to all of my free tax resources, many of which I have updated for this tax year. On that page, you will find podcast episodes, videos, and articles on all kinds of tax topics relevant to PhDs and PhDs to be. There are also opportunities to join the Personal Finance for PhDs mailing list to receive PDF summaries and spreadsheets that you can work with. Again, you can find all of these free resources linked from pfforphds.com/tax. Now back to the interview. And since we were just talking about scarce resources, I was really compelled by the book is basically five big ideas, 5 big chapters. And I was really compelled by the fourth one, which is around leveraging the resources available to you as a graduate student or as an academic. And so can you just expound a little bit more about what kinds of resources might be available to a graduate student or an academic that could, help them as an entrepreneurial scholar?
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually start off the book with this idea of that thinking entrepreneurially means asking yourself, given who I am, what I know, and who I know, what kind of opportunities could I create for myself? And so here we are thinking about sort of like the intellectual capital that you have, the human capital that you have, and the social capital that you have, right? Who do you know? What do you know? And who are you? To start thinking about how you can leverage all of that. So let me talk about this, first of all, this idea of like who you know. In academia, and particularly in the humanities, we tend to sort of think of um, this like lone scholar sitting in a library doing work very independently. And I really want to disrupt this idea, even in the humanities, because even if you're writing a monograph, I want to put forth the idea that scholarship is a community sport, even if you end up writing alone. Why is it a community sport? I want people to sort of imagine that the academic landscape is this vast network where each node is a person and each link is a potential collaboration or a shared idea or even like just a mutual support system. Because nobody should be doing this alone. And I remember even like as a grad student, I'm in the social sciences, so there's a fair amount of collaboration, but the sort of reticence that some of my colleagues had to ask each other for help, to seek out help from more senior people was astonishing to me because I came from working in startups and in management consulting where it was very, very common to just ask for help or ask for other people for ideas. So when I say that I want people to think of scholarship as a community sport, what that means in practice is like thinking about your network and relationships that you have, not just like how do you in an icky way try to extract value from that, right? That's an icky like and I think incorrect version of what it means to network. Instead, I want people to think about networking as the opportunity to actually help other people, right? Not extracting value, but actually putting yourself out there so that your idea and someone else's idea, or sort of your problem and the problem that someone else is experiencing, can have sort of mutually beneficial solutions, right? That you in partnership with other people can problem solve together, right? And so, for example, at one point when I was a sort of latter stage grad student, I was working on a paper and I got really stuck on it. And a new postdoc came to Stanford and we were having lunch and I started telling him about this paper. And then I realized that like what I was missing was like a whole framing around gender. He happened to be a gender scholar. And I realized like it would be really beneficial if he came and joined as an author on this paper. And it was this very, very mutually beneficial decision and collaboration that, by the way, has actually ended up, that paper landed in the top sociology journal. And I don't think I would have been able to do that alone. And since then, he and I have collaborated on several other things. But it wasn't like I was like, oh, this person is coming and I want to just extract value by having lunch with them and like seeing what I can sort of get out of that person. Like I knew that this would be a mutually beneficial relationship. And so there are many ways to think about how can you identify people in your network, but also develop relationships with people who are outside of your network by thinking about like, where might you have complementary skills with other people? How might you be able to offer value to somebody else's project, right? And so not just thinking about your own career advancement, but thinking about like, how can we do more with what we have by collaborating, right? If like I think of, I think therefore I am, instead like I think therefore I collaborate.
Yeah, as we were talking about that, I was just thinking like, yes, this is such a human endeavor. Like it's human to have relationships with other people and build things together. And I like what you said there because under the topic of like leveraging resources, really what you're saying is think of yourself as a resource that you can offer to other people, and then they mutually can offer their resource of themselves, in this case, back to you. So it's quite mutual. So I love that. Any other sort of categories of ways people can leverage resources?
So when people hear the terms leverage resources, they immediately think of money, right? And sort of funding. And so I do want to touch upon that. And what does it mean to sort of think entrepreneurially about funding? In the book, I give examples of people who have been very successful at getting different fellowships. And there are different ways to think about how to be strategic in those. Like, do you go for a bunch of sort of small, low, sort of low bar grants where it doesn't take very much to apply to them? Like maybe you can repurpose something and then you just apply to a bunch of really small things, or do you invest several months into putting together something that has bigger reward, right? You always want to be thinking in all of academic life, you want to diversify your sort of risk benefit portfolio, and funding is one of those things. I'll give an example of something that happened to me recently, because a lot of thinking entrepreneurially is like taking advantage of opportunities that you didn't necessarily expect. And so recently, Tulane had somebody from the Russell Sage Foundation come and give a talk about their funding streams. And I went, and in that talk, I realized I was like, oh, I don't have anything relevant for this because they're looking for really more early stage projects than anything that I have. I sort of wrote it off, like I didn't even take the opportunity to meet with a program officer. And then about a month later, I had kind of like a crisis in one of my projects that resulted in me pulling out of the project for a variety of reasons. And I was having this like sort of moment of both like panic, but also seeing opportunity emerge from this breakup, where I was like, oh my gosh, like this gives me an opportunity to actually do a totally different study. And I was like, oh gosh, but that's like really early stage. Where would I get funding? And I was like, wait a minute. I was like, I just sat through one of those RSF things. So right away, I contacted the person at Tulane who had set up that program officer to come. And I said, I all of a sudden have an idea. Is it too late to meet with them? And she said, let me get in touch. So I met with a program officer. I learned so much. I told them what my idea was. And through that conversation, I learned about like some stuff about their grants that I wouldn't have been able to figure out just based off of their website. Like it turns out that there was a stream of funding that wasn't going to continue, and it would be very beneficial for me to apply to this particular stream of funding. So I did, and I submitted a letter of intent, which is their first stage. And I actually made it through to the proposal stage. So I should hear back in a couple of weeks about whether I got it or not. But I at least feel very good that I made it through the LOI stage. And again, the like key takeaway is I didn't, I put myself out there. I went to the session. I didn't think anything would come of it. And then when I had this like moment of crisis and I saw opportunity, I was like, oh, wait a minute, I can connect the dots here. So thinking about like, expansively about funding and resources, and just like sometimes going to stuff that you may think doesn't have any benefit for you. You never know when there will be a payoff.
Hmm. And I'll speak as a business owner. I actually don't identify with the term entrepreneur for my particular type of business, but as a business owner, I have to think about the revenue streams in my business. And I might have predictions about which revenue streams are going to work out to what capacity, but it's really beneficial, as you were just saying, to have ideas maybe on the back burner of other revenue streams, other fellowships, other grants you could apply to. And so if you have the capacity, like in your example that you just gave, if you suddenly have the capacity to be applying for things or putting effort into an area that you weren't before, then you say, oh, I have some background in this. I know how to turn this on in a quicker way than just, starting completely like cold. I really love that example. Anything else you want to add? I just, for the podcast listeners, especially if you're a longtime podcast listener, chapter 4 of this book was really special because Ilana included my podcast like interviews as some of the resources, and also interviewed some other people that I've had on the podcast before. So like it was like seeing some old friends in this chapter, which was really exciting. And also, of course, also pulled in some other interviews that I found really great. So I thought you actually summed this up really well in the concluding notes for that chapter, where you said, remember, every funding opportunity is also a chance to expand your community and collaborate with others who share your vision. And actually ties really well both those points together. So thank you so much. Anything else you want to add in about this leveraging resources topic?
I'll add one more thing. And this is sort of this idea of connecting with people so that you can expand your knowledge of what is possible in the world. And what I mean by that is there are things like that I remember as a doctoral student that I was like, there's no way that I can do this because I have no mental map and I have no schema in my head for how to make this possible. So for example, towards the end of grad school, I was like, I want to write a book. I had written a multi-paper dissertation, but I wanted to write a book. But I have no mental model of how you go about writing a book when you are a PhD student. And it seemed like out of the realm of possibility. And nowhere in my graduate program did anyone ever train me to think about this. And I had a friend who, as a grad student, was able to, not a friend, he wasn't even at my institution, but it was someone who I had met along the way. And I knew that he had been able to secure not one, but sort of two offers from prestigious book presses for an advance contract. And I was like, wait, that's a thing? I didn't know that was possible. And once I knew it was a thing, and he helped me understand how it became a thing and walked me through all the steps that he went through and even shared his proposal, I had this like ability to think beyond what I could think about earlier. I was like, oh, if he could do it, maybe I could do it too. And here's what it could look like. And I followed some of the similar steps, and it became possible. So I think we don't think of collaborating as sort of an opportunity to think beyond ourselves, but that's what it does for me. It gives me that sort of opportunity to imagine possibilities that I thought were off the table.
Yeah. So this is your second book, and you use this book as an example in, I believe it's the fifth chapter of an entrepreneurial scholarship activity, right? Of publishing a book. So can you just tell us really briefly how the book came about?
Yeah. The book came about from something I totally didn't expect and out of a sort of a story of failure, which I think is like a very defining feature of entrepreneurship. When I was a graduate student at the very end of grad school, I was a sixth year, I wasn't even taking classes, but because I was in this mindset of like, I want to get everything I can out of Stanford while I'm here and while it's free. I was auditing a bunch of classes. I was auditing classes on like how to be a good public speaker and improv. And one of the classes I audited was how to write for the public. And it was taught by Sam Weinberg, a professor at the School of Education. And our final assignment was to write an op-ed, right? Not surprisingly. And mostly everyone in the class took this opportunity to write an op-ed about their research. And at the time, I was about to graduate and I was reflecting sort of deeply about how my own PhD journey went. And so I took this opportunity to write an op-ed that like basically I submitted to a couple places and it failed. It did not get published. And it was really frustrating. And Sam, who I really, really have to give a lot of credit to. He was like, you shouldn't give up on this idea. There's something there. And even if you sort of put it down for a little while, you have to promise me that one day you will pick it back up because I see it has a future. Like he believed in it. And so for 2 years, Emily, I kid you not, 2 years, this thing just like sat on my computer. And so about a week before I started my job at Tulane, I was already in my new office and I was about to go home for the day. And I was like, you know what? I was like, I have childcare. Nothing is going to like blow up at home if I just like stay in the office for 2 more hours. And I'm going to pick up that op-ed and I'm going to dust it off, and see what I can do with it. Cause I promised Sam that I would. And I did. And I sort of spoke from a place of what I knew. Like I leaned into this startup and consulting experience that I had. And I wrote this op-ed I revised it, I think with the title, Why PhD Students Should Think Like Entrepreneurs. And I submitted, and then I thought about, okay, I have this, where can I submit it to? At that point, I already had published once in Inside Higher Ed. So I submitted it to them, right? That was like the most obvious choice. I already had a personal connection there. And within 2 hours, they wrote me back and they were like, yeah, this is great. We will take it. And I was like, oh, that was easy. Okay. And then a few weeks later, it came out and, I got a couple of nice emails from faculty and some from therapists who said how much this resonated for them and working with grad students. And then I got the most unexpected email. It was from the editor at Princeton University Press, Peter. And he was like, this is great. Do you want to flesh this out into a book? And I was like, I'm sorry, come again? You want me to write a book on this topic? And so that is the sort of birth story of this book. And so it really came out of something very unexpected. And to write this book, I went out and I interviewed about 45 people who hold either different positions in academia or who have left academia or who are entrepreneurs. So this book really required me to think about like, who am I? What do I know? And who do I know to make it happen? So in that way, it is very much like a story of an entrepreneurial endeavor.
Absolutely. I can see that so clearly. I'm so glad that you brought that up so that I could ask you this question about how the book came to be. And so interesting that there was that 2 year just time period. And I don't know what it was. I don't know if it was the rewriting that you did or how things had changed in your perspective in 2 years or how the world had changed in the 2 years, but somehow the idea clearly hit the second time around. And that's fantastic. Where can people find the book?
The people can find the book at Princeton University Press. And I think in your show notes, I can share a discount code that people can use. People can also find it on Amazon, as well as learn more about it on my website, www.ilanahorwitz, that's ILANAHORWITZ.com. And I encourage people to reach out to me if they want to learn more about it.
All right. And since you said that you love dispensing advice, we have one more opportunity for you to do so, which is with the standard question that I ask of all my guests, which is what is your best financial advice for another early career PhD? And it could be something we've touched on in the interview already, or it could be something completely new.
My best advice is to pursue a side hustle if possible. And I recognize that it is not possible for everyone, especially international students, students who are parents. I get that this is something that isn't available to everybody. But if you have the opportunity, and sometimes the pay might be so bad, like my first side hustle, I made $12 an hour, and it was absolutely worth it because I gained so many skills from the experience. But don't just think about it from a financial perspective. Think about all the other different ways that it could benefit you. And the money that you get on the side is also a really nice perk.
Very good. Thanks for tying all those themes together. Well, Ilana, thank you so much for coming back on the podcast. It's been a pleasure to speak with you again.
Thanks, Emily.
Listeners, thank you for joining me for this episode. I have a gift for you. You know that final question I ask of all my guests regarding their best financial advice? My team has collected short summaries of all the answers ever given on the podcast into a document that is updated with each new episode release. You can gain access to it by registering for my mailing list at pfforphds.com/advice. Would you like to access transcripts or videos of each episode? I link the show notes for each episode from pfforphds.com/podcast. See you in the next episode. And remember, you don't have to have a PhD to succeed with personal finance, but it helps. Nothing you hear on this podcast should be taken as financial, tax, or legal advice for any individual. The music is Stages of Awakening by Poddington Bear from the Free Music Archive and is shared under CC by NC. Podcast editing by me and show notes creation by Dr. Jill Hoffman.